like you to tell us your journey with the Lord. Just tell us your story
All right.
in Christ.
I'm happy to do that. Um, I was born and raised in Duluth, Minnesota, from a working class family. The only church I was ever exposed to when I was a kid was a Lutheran church, liberal uh, uh, division of the Lutheran church. And for me, all church meant was sermon notes when I was a kid and getting confirmed. And when I was ninth grade, I got confirmed. It was supposedly a confirmation of faith, but what it really was is I no longer had to take sermon notes and I no longer had to go to church because
You graduated.
I graduated. And I didn't go to church because I didn't see anything in it. And I was raised in the 70s, you know, and all the stuff that happened in the 70s I partook in, the drugs, the alcohol, and the riotous living. And I went to work right out of high school. My only goal in life was to go to work for the railroad that my brother worked for, and was just to continue to party and just live my life like all my friends. And so, but in ninth grade, what happened with me is I had got together with a couple of my buddies, and I had said something about one of the leaders in our group, and it got back to him, and so they kind of kicked me out of the group, and it was neighborhood kids that I'd grown up with, and I'd known them since kindergarten. That was my first real taste of rejection, to the point where I was, it devastated me. And my mom and dad were basically, my dad was a non-entity in my life, and my mom was an alcoholic. And my brother, he was 3 years older than me, and he was doing his own thing, so they really didn't come into play. So I ended up walking in all this fear throughout my whole ninth grade year, and kids would, pick on me and throw me up against the lockers and, and do stuff that kids do at that age, cruel things. And so, that went on for about a year. And I would basically get out of school and I'd run home and I would either sit in the house and watch TV. My dad put up a basketball backboard and hoop, and I started shooting baskets, and I got really good at basketball because I play basketball like 8 hours a day. And then one day in science class, one of the guys that I used to hang out with, he said to me, "Rich," he goes, "Do you want to hang out with everybody again?" And I said, "Yeah." I mean, I didn't have a life. I didn't have any friends. I was walking in fear. I said, "Yeah." And I was basically, I didn't say it, but I was basically at the point, whatever I have to do. He said, "Well, we're having a party down at the shack tonight." We had a shack that we had built in the woods by our elementary school. And he said, "Just come down with something to drink and you're right back in the group again." Because during the time, from the time that they did that to me, to that time where he talked to me, they started experimenting with drinking alcohol. And so I got some Everclear, which is 180 proof grain alcohol in a baby food jar. And I drank it and I got inebriated, but it got me back into the group. So the day that I took a drink, I was an alcoholic because it was my identity. And so I partied hard, and as much as you could as a ninth grader, on the weekends. And so I started drinking when I was 15, and that went into drugs when I started smoking pot when I was 16. And I started taking acid and speed and the other drugs of the 70s when I was 18. And my goal was, after high school, was to get on the railroad and go to work, because it was a pretty good paying job for somebody who didn't have any experience, And my brother worked on the railroad, and so I followed him, whatever he did, because my brother was a jock and I wasn't a jock. And my dad seemed to gravitate to him because he was successful, and my dad really didn't want anything to do with me because I wasn't. So I tried to please my dad by following my brother. And so I went to work for the railroad, and if you know anything about the railroad or construction industry, especially in the 70s, before all the drug testing and all that was going on, it was just a brothel. I mean, every machinist had a bottle in his locker, you could drink, you could do drugs, you could do whatever, and nobody knew it as long as you weren't obvious, So I ended up going to work on the track gang, and then I got a job in the mechanical department, and the mechanical department is where you're working on the locomotives. Well, Minnesota's seasonal, so the closer it gets to winter, people start getting laid off because lakes freeze up. There's no shipping, there's no ore. They don't need as many employees, okay? So I got low man on the seniority list, and so I had to go north almost to the Canadian border to a little town called Virginia and work in a small railroad yard up there. And the machinist was an alcoholic. So we got along really well. My day consisted of showing up at work at 11, sanding and fueling about 3 locomotives, going to the local bar, closing that down, picking up a 12-pack, coming back to the shop, drinking it, passing out, and the foreman would wake me up in the morning, and we'd go home. And I did that for about a year. But what was happening is in the morning I was driving home drunk. And so instead of doing that, I figured, well, why don't I just move up there and then I don't have to drive as far. So I got in this apartment and with 2 other friends that were both alcoholics and drug addicts. And they both worked on the railroad, and so we shared an apartment. And I was drinking, and we lived upstairs from a place called the Webb Bar. And I know it was the Webb Bar because it had a picture of Spider-Man on the on the thing, where it said Webb Bar. And one night, I was getting ready to go out and drink. And the thing about the Iron Range of Minnesota in the 70s, there was so much money to be made in the mines, the iron ore mines, that every kid had money. So they opened up all these bars. So these little towns would have 20, 30 bars in them. And you'd have disco and country, and you'd have live bands, and so you'd basically just walk out the door, and you could just, you didn't even have to drive, So I was getting ready to go down and shoot pool, and I was having a couple of beers, and back in the day they had the 6-packs with the plastic rings, and I was just sitting on the edge of the couch, and I had my finger in the rings, and I had 2 beers sitting there, and HBO was in its infancy, brand new, and they were putting anything on there that they could fill it with, This is about 9 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, nobody's watching TV, let alone brand new HBO. So they had a show come on, and I was just getting ready to walk out the door and go downstairs because that's where the bar was. And it was Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. And I walked by the TV and I saw that, and I sat on the arm of the couch and I didn't move. That was my first exposure to anything God other than the Lutheran Church. And it scared the you-know-what out of me. But I didn't change. I continued to get worse. I drank. I ended up crashing cars. I drove off a bridge one time in January, and because it was January, it was frozen. I was thrown from my car, 25 below zero. I have gash in my head like this. And because the doctor said because it was so cold, the blood coagulated and you stopped bleeding, and that's why you're alive right now. So I was going crazy. I mean, I was off the deep end, drinking, partying. And so I came back down from the Iron Range. I got the seniority back, and I came back down to the car shop in the town that I lived in. And I would come in late, and I would come in drunk, and I would be drunk at work, and I'd be stoned at work, and and I thought I was getting away with all this stuff. And then one day they caught me sleeping. The foreman caught me sleeping. And and I had heard that they caught other guys sleeping before, and I thought no big deal. And then about 3 days later, they came, the shop steward and the superintendent of the car shop came and talked to me and said, "We need to talk to you. We need to have a meeting." And so they brought me into their office, and they said, "We've been watching you for about 90 days. We've got a rap sheet on you about that long." They said, "You've got 2 choices. You either go to rehab or you lose your job." So I picked rehab, but I picked rehab just because I wanted to save my job, so I could keep partying. And I had a 1-hit pot pipe, and it was a little box, and it had marijuana on the side of it, and you'd pull the door open, and it had this little thing that would spring up, and you'd pack it, and you could smoke it, and it's basically undetectable. And I'd carry that around at work all day, and I'd get stoned. And I went to this friend of mine. I said, "Dave," his name was Dave Erickson. I said, "Eric," I said, "hang on to this for me because I have to go to rehab. When I come out, I want it back." And I went into rehab, and rehab is kind of like boot camp. At least it was then. I don't know what it's like now, but it was a 30-day program. And when I worked for the railroad, I never saw a medical bill. I never saw a doctor bill. I had 100% disability. I mean, it was the old days. It's not true anymore, but that's the way it was. And so I went into rehab, and the first thing they did is they put you in pajamas. You know, and I'm this rebellious punk, you know, just, you know, and that didn't go over well with me at all. And I started raising hell. And I got, you know, and I got reprimanded for this, that, and the other thing. And then I was about 14 days into my 30-day program. Tell you how old it was. I saw the first space shuttle go up April 12th, 1981. So that's how long ago it was. Anyway, they had group therapy for everybody. Everybody had to go to group. And most of the time, you know, I just kind of sit there, you know, and listen to everybody and think, I just can't wait to get out of here, you know. And then one day I went in there, and they had all got together, the counselors, everybody, and they said, this is my day in the hot seat. Said, we're not letting him walk out this time. He's not just going to sit there and not say anything. You know, he's going to. So they jumped on me. And I threw a living Bible in my suitcase. Because what happened after the late great planet Earth is I came back down to the car shop, and track 5, nobody wanted to work on track 5 because that's where all the Christians were. Okay? And they stuck me on track 5. And so every day I'd come in, hungover, sick, drunk, whatever, and these Christians would be talking to me. And I'd just tell them, you know, get out of my way, you know, stay away from me. And they just kept, and they'd have a prayer meeting in the oil house every day, and the focus of their prayer was me.
Wow.
And they started praying for me. And as they prayed for me, my life got worse.
Uh-oh.
That's how I ended up in treatment, because I went completely. And the more they prayed, the worse my life got. Because I watched them, I talked to them, and they said, we were praying for you here, we were praying for you there. And I could see the corresponding things that were going on in my life. And so I surrendered to Christ to one of my friends on track 5 that was a former partier like me, and he gotten saved. And it was so radical. There was such a difference in his life that I knew it was something real.
This before or after?
That was before treatment.
Okay.
And then, you know, I started doing the things that, you know, the Christians did at 21 years old. I started going to the youth groups, and I started going to the college groups. And back in the day, they had free will concerts all the time. So you go to a concert, you know, and I started doing all that. Well, we had to go to they had a conference, a retreat, a Christian retreat in southern Minnesota, and they asked me to come with. And I was playing volleyball, and I was having a good time, and I went up for a spike, and I came down, and I landed in a gopher hole, and I just ripped my knee. I just felt it go crack and rip, and that was it. That was before arthroscopic surgery. So I was laid up for about 6 weeks. And I was sitting there, I'm a brand new Christian, you know, and I'm not drinking now. God had removed that from me. And so I'm sitting there day after day, and I'm watching soap operas in my house, you know, because there's nothing else to do. Because all my party friends, they're not responsible, and they're hanging around. They're trying to hang around with me, and all my Christian friends are all responsible. They have jobs, and they're not around. So they started coming around, and one thing led to another, and I went down to the local saloon, and I started drinking Cokes with them while they were drinking beer, and that lasted about a week. One day I took a drink, you know, I drank a beer, and that was it. Guilt, condemnation, everything, and I just went completely off the deep end. That was in August of 1980. January of 1981, I went on my last hurrah. I met a girl in a bar. We went down to Key West for 2 weeks, and it was just inebriation for 2 weeks. I mean, I can't even remember most of it. Came back from that, and that's when the railroad confronted me with all my stuff. And so I went into treatment April of 1981. And 2 weeks into it, they put me on this hot seat. And so before I went in, I took my living Bible that one of these people gave me, and I threw it in my suitcase. So I went into my room, and I'm just frustrated and angry, and, you know, and I'm thinking, you know, I thought I was just going to skate through this thing and go back, you know. So I took my Bible out, and I threw it down on my bed, and it flipped open, and it was Matthew 6. And I looked down, it was verse 34. It said, don't worry about tomorrow. Live one day at a time. And really, that's become my whole ministry. God saved me with that verse, and that's really become the focus of what my ministry is God has revealed to me the one day at a time life in Christ. So you're supposed to, then I went back to group after that the next day. And there was such a transformation in my life that about the third weekend, the counselors got together. They brought me into their office, and I thought they were going to yell at me. And they said, "We have no idea what has happened to you. You came in here, you sat there, you did nothing, now you're participating." I led 2 women to Christ that were in my group. One of them had cirrhosis of the liver. Her stomach was distended so bad she was dying. I mean, she was done. I led her to Christ. I led her friend to Christ. And this counselor says to me, we got to know what happened. And so I shared Christ with them. And he said, "We let you out right now, but insurance regulations say we've got to keep you till the end of the month." And I just floated through the rest of the time. It was so, I didn't want to leave. One thing about and I've never been in prison or anything, but I've ministered to a lot of prison people. Being institutionalized, there's a safety factor there. Because when you're dealing with drugs and alcohol and all the stuff that's on the outside, you're in this safe zone. And so I didn't want to leave. But I did. And I went home, and the counselor brought me home, dropped me off, and I heard my phone ring. And I lived in when I was 19, I bought a 12 by 60 trailer. That was my first place. It was just for partying. Okay, that's the only reason I bought it, was for partying. And the walls were 2 inches thick. That's how they were made back. It was a 1971 Invader. And so, my wall phone was hanging on the door right when you walk in the door. And so I got out of the car, he dropped me off, and I heard my phone ringing. And I ran up to the door, and I dropped my suitcase, and I opened the door. "Hey, Novek, now that you're out of treatment, you want to go get stoned?"
Uh-oh.
Bam! I slammed the phone down. These are guys that I hung around with since kindergarten. To this day, I've not seen any of them. Not seen any of them. Because I knew from the first time, when I walked away, I knew what I was facing. I knew where their hearts were, and I knew, because they were the ones that brought me down to the bar. They were the ones that said, "Hey, Rich, just one beer, you'll be okay." And I ended up in treatment. So I knew from that what they were going to do again, what was going to happen. So I had to cut that off completely. And then I started going to AA meetings, and AA just didn't do it for me, because AA is not Christ-centered. It doesn't promote itself as being Christ-centered. And so I was coming out of a Christian concert one day, and there was a guy standing there, and he's handing out these pamphlets, Alcoholics Victorious Christ-Centered Counseling New Life Groups. And I got the pamphlet, and I opened it up. 2 Corinthians 5:17, "If any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has passed away, all things are become new." And I'm thinking, wow, this is what I like. This is what I want to do. So I met the guy, the director of the group, and Bob became my early mentor. He introduced me to the deep teachers right away. As soon as I got saved, I started cutting my teeth on Andrew Murray, Watchman Nee, Hudson Taylor, Ian Thomas, A.W. Tozer. I started reading that stuff right out of the gate. And I started counseling, and then Bob saw that I was ready, so I became a leader of a group. And then Bob, he ended up being a pastor in a church, and then I took over the group as the director. Then the bottom fell out of the steel, and the bottom had fallen out of the steel industry. That was in 1981. I bought a house in October of 1981, my first house. In January of 82, the bottom fell out of the steel industry, and I lost everything. I went from making $700 every 2 weeks take home to $125 a week unemployment. And I lived like that for 3 years. And it ended up being about $730 a month. I had to go on welfare. I met my ex-wife in treatment, and we ended up getting married in August of 82, in August of 82, because I thought, what happens with the railroad, what happens with the industries up north, is it's seasonal. So you may not work all winter, but you'll go back to work in the spring, because it just depends on what the industry is doing, how the steel industry is working. But this was when Brazilian and Japanese steel was introduced into the American steel industry, and it was cheap. So all these countries stopped buying U.S. steel. And I worked for U.S. Steel. I worked for U.S. Steel Corporation. And the bottom fell out of the steel industry. There was 50% unemployment where I lived. There's 25,000 people moved out of the county I was in 3 years. And we tried to hang on. And we ended up losing that. I ended up losing that house. That was the first house I lost. That was the first real trial. I mean, I went from getting saved, being in this ministry, and losing my house and living on nothing for 3 years as soon as I got saved. I mean, God didn't waste any time. He brought me right into the frying pan right away. And it was in 1983 that Bob came to me and he said, Rich, he goes, you're not supposed to work a job, because every job I'd try to work, I'd either get laid off or, something would happen. And he said, you're not supposed to work a job. You're supposed to be in full-time ministry. And so I started trying to get in ministry, and nothing ever opened up. And Bob says to me, he goes, Rich, do you really want everything God has for you? Do you really want everything God has for you? He says, then pray this prayer. And he prescribed a prayer to me, just like a doctor giving a prescription. And the prayer was, Lord, bring me to the end of myself and give me a revelation of who I am in Christ. And I started praying that in 1983. We lost our house in November of 83. Moved to Seattle in 1984. I worked for $6 an hour driving a roach coach. You know what a roach coach is?
Yeah.
$6 an hour driving a roach coach with no benefits. I worked a second job, and I worked a third job on the weekends. Had a brand new baby. And as hard as all that was my honeymoon period in Christ. And that's when God began to open up to me. Because I've been reading Watchman Nee and all these people, and I read Watchman Nee until I couldn't read it anymore. It just blew me away. And then he started opening up the truth of Galatians 2:20. It's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. But I kept praying that prayer. And things would get bad, and things would get worse. But I kept praying that prayer. And God was saying to me, because one time I was sitting down at my heater, and it was in the middle of the winter, and I was sitting on my register because I do that in the morning to warm up. And God said, I'm going to take you to a place where you walk above your circumstances. Do you believe me? And then he led me to Habakkuk. Habakkuk, though the fig tree doesn't blossom, there's no fruit on the vine, the yield of the olive failed, there's no cattle in the stalls, yet I'll exalt in the Lord. I'll glory in the Holy One of Israel, for he's given me hinds feet to walk above my high places. And so he said, I'm going to take you to that place. And I had no idea what it was going to take to go there. And so in 1987, I moved back to Minnesota because of we had our son Chip out there. And my wife began to miss her grandparents and her mom, for being the grandma thing, so we came back. And just, went through more fiery trials. And we ended up moving to Florida. Got a house in 1987. Lived in it for 7 years. We moved to Florida in 1995. And so I was married at that point about 13 years. And my wife started drinking as a Christian. And I started drinking. And it didn't take long before I was right back in it again. But before that happened, I was going to marriage counseling with a guy in Vero Beach, Florida. I drove truck, and I'd drive all over Florida delivering oil products. And I was driving through a neighborhood one time, and I was trying to take a shortcut to get to this place to make this delivery. And I looked over and I drove by this building. I had my 48-foot trailer, 60 feet of truck, and I'm driving through this residential area. I look over and I see this building that says Life Exchange Ministries. And there's a place for my truck to park. From that point on, there was never a place for my truck to park. Never. I had to park it over on a parking lot. It was like a Walmart parking lot or something. But that day, God made a way for that truck to have a place to park. And I got out of it, I walked in. And they had a table like that set up, and I wanted to talk to one of the counselors. I wanted to see what it was about, because I saw Life Exchange, and I'd been a part of the Exchange Life thing through Chuck Solomon, in Seattle, so I thought, well, maybe that's what that is, And so I went in there, and while I was waiting to talk to the counselor, they had books on the thing, and one of them was Norman Grubb, and the other one was Andrew Murray, and then I think they had Watchman Nee. And that was the books they had while you were waiting to talk to your counselor. And I met this guy. His name is Bill Phillips. Louis Gregory called me 2 days ago and he said, I noticed that you had Bill Phillips on one of your posts. He goes, I discipled Bill, and he got into this big thing, and I said, I've been looking for him for 15 years, you know. I wanted to tell him I'm alive and well, and I'm still here, you know, because he counseled me for a year. And right at the beginning of the counseling, he was talking to me about this guy named Norman Grubb. And he said, I have 3 books I want you to read. One is called Who Am I? The other one's Yes, I Am. And he said, and I have copies of both of those. And I can give you copies. This was before the internet, so there was no way to get a hold of this stuff unless you knew somebody, right? And he didn't know the people in Louisville or anything. So, but he said, I have 2 copies of each. I'll give you one of Who Am I, and I'll give you one of Yes, I Am. Well, when I was in Seattle, we became part of a home church. We actually became part of a garage church because I met in a garage. And the worship leader, he came up to me one day, just out of the blue, after we were having this potluck, and he says, Rich, he says, you know, I really love God, but I really like smoking pot. And I said, yeah. And he goes, and I'm going to go back to smoking pot. You know, we were still seeing in separation, and, you know, we weren't seeing what we see today. And he said, and I've got this box of books, and I was wondering if you want it, because if you don't want it, I'm just going to, you know, give it away or burn it or whatever. He goes, but I don't want them anymore. And he gave me this box of books. It was in 1984 when I was in Seattle. And the box had Andrew Murray, The Holiest of All, had 3 booklets by Jesse Penn Lewis. I had this book in there by this guy named Norman Grubb, The Deep Things of God. So Bill says, I want you to read 3 books. I want you to read Who Am I? Yes, I Am. And there's a 3rd one I want you to have, but I don't have a copy of it, and I don't know where to get a copy. And I said, Bill, is it called The Deep Things of God?
Which you'd had for 3 years?
I had it for 14 years.
Right.
14 years it sat on my bookshelf, and I never opened it up. Because in institutional Christianity, oneness thinking is criminal. Because you're New Age. And when you're really ingrained in the institution, you know, they're so separated and divided. Even their sects are the word denomination, which means separation. You know, I mean, even the different sects of institutional Christianity. And so I didn't read it. I never opened it up. I thought it was oneness, universalist stuff, and, you know, Jesus only. But everywhere I went, I put it on my bookshelf. I never threw it away. And so I opened it up, and I started reading those 3 books, and they brought me into a new place in Christ that I'd never been before. Seeing Jesus in me as a person, having a personal relationship with God. And so Bill instilled all that in me. He gave me that. But I still couldn't make the connection in a real way that he was wanting me to make that connection. Because some of that takes time, okay? You can't just decide you're going to be deep in Christ. I realize that, okay? That takes time. God does use time in that way. So anyway, every time I'd go into counseling, I went and talked to my boss, and I said, listen, there's this really cool place in Vero Beach. I'd like to take my lunch there. So if it's possible, I want to counsel with this guy. Don and I are going through some marriage problems. He's going to help me with some marriage counseling. I want to have my lunch right there every week. So I counseled with Bill, and it was 200 miles away from where I lived every week. And we got to about the end of the first year, and Bill said to me, you know, Rich, I'd love to continue with you, but he said, I just can't. He goes, you just don't see it. And he said, God is saying to me, you're not going to see it until you go out there. So I'm sending you out. And it was in 98. And in 99, I started drinking heavy. And I had an affair on my wife because my ex-wife never touched me. For 12 years, the last 12 years of our marriage, I slept on my couch. And she let me know on a regular basis that she not only didn't like me, but she hated me. And so this woman paid some attention to me one time. I was going to school too. I started going to school. And we were at finals, and after finals, we all went out to celebrate. She said, "You want to go with?" And I said, "Yeah." And one thing led to another. And I ended up having a short affair with this woman. My ex-wife found out. She went crazy, and she had an affair with this guy. Mine lasted 2 weeks. Hers lasted 2 years. And that was just God, taking me to that place that I'd asked him to take me in 1983, bringing me to the end of Rich. And she would have this affair, I would I'd come home from work at 5 o'clock and she'd be ready to go out the door because she had this in front of me for almost 2 years. I was emasculated as a man in every possible way you could be. I tell people when I came out of my marriage, I had to look up 6 feet to tie my shoes. I was so beaten down. And she beat me emotionally, but she also physically abused me in front of my kids, and I never laid a hand on her. And so when you don't defend yourself, people keep coming at you. You know what I'm saying? But it sounds really weird, but that was the one thing I wasn't going to give her. As weird as that might sound, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of being able to say that I touched her our entire marriage. So I wasn't doing that for her, I was doing it for me. It was like, you do this to me, I'm not touching you. And so one day my daughter, my 16-year-old daughter, she'll be 29 in October, Cassie. We were sitting in my bedroom and we were crying because Dawn had gone out again. She'd gone for a couple days. We didn't know where she was. We didn't know if she was dead. She went completely off the deep end with this guy drinking and partying and doing stuff, and she'd be gone for a couple days. And Cassie and I were in my bedroom and we were praying. And I did another one of those things. I said, God, and I threw the Bible down. And it opened up to Hosea. It said, the wife of your youth loves adultery, but you're going to go get her and take her back. I'm saying, I'm not going through enough, with everything that I'm going through. By the way, I was a sole provider of 7 people for 20 years. 1 income, 5 kids, and my wife and I for 20 years. So I was working 70-hour weeks. And, and I was drinking heavy and I was going through all this. And then God says this to me. He says, you're to take her back. And the reason he did that is because when we divorced, my kids ended up with her. And if I would have left, the whole family would have been blown to hell. And so God used me to hold it together until the point that he finally said, you can go now. And he used her to kick me out. And then I really went off the deep end. I mean, I rented a room in the same town. I drank from morning till night. I was in a semi, driving a loaded semi down the freeways of Orlando, drunk. I didn't care about anything. I was planning my suicide. I'd lost my kids. I'd lost my wife. I'd lost my desire for God. I'd lost my hopes and dreams of being in the ministry. I'd lost everything. And you know what? I just said, screw it. I don't care. So I drank a 6-pack, and I was driving by a church in Lakeland, Florida, and I just saw the marquee, the top of it from the freeway. It said, Revival Tonight. And I said, I'm going to go in and tell those Christians what I think of them. And I walked in the door, and there was 1 seat sitting right there. I said, I'm going to go tell them what I think of them, then I'm going to go out and kill myself. That was my thought. I'm going to drive into a tree. I'm going to drink myself into I'm done. I can't handle anymore, God. I can't do it anymore. And I walked in there, and there was 1 seat right when I walked in the door. I walked in the door, there was a seat, 1 seat right there. God knew I wouldn't take 1 more step past that seat. So he had that seat for me right there. I walked in and I sat down. I was just waiting for my chance to stand up and tell them to all go and, R-rated. And the guy stops, just like that. He goes, God has told me there's somebody in here that's planning to kill himself.
Oh, my goodness.
He said he wants you to stand up right now. I stood up. About 100 people came around me and started praying for me. And I walked out of there and I never had another suicidal. But I went into the fire worse, way worse than what it was. And God wanted to deal with that suicidal thing before I was going to go into what I was going to go into. And I ended up moving to Lakeland and moving in with this family, and this other guy was there, and he was a worse drunk than me, and we just went completely off the wall. And I just basically told God to go screw himself. I wanted nothing more to do with God. I wanted nothing more to do with Christianity. You showed me all this stuff. You showed me all this deep stuff, and look what you do. You don't make any opportunity for anything. You just keep bringing the pain and the pressure and the trials. And so I moved in with this couple, this really wonderful Christian couple. What happened is my car broke down. I was driving truck for this crappy company. I lost a great job with Home Depot. I was just about ready to get my own store, $150,000 a year, delivering products as a contractor for Cardinal Delivery, which is right here out of Atlanta. And it was Clearwater Beach, and I'd driven for almost a year as a sub driver all over the country, helping people train drivers. And they finally had a store open in the Orlando area, and they said, "Rich, this is your store." Clearwater Beach, Florida. I mean, paradise, man. Beautiful. And what I'm doing is delivering building products to all the mansions that are going up on the beach. So my territory isn't even 50 miles, you know. So I can do 15, 20 deliveries a day at $35 a pop, you know, and I'm going to be making bucks. Finally, after all this hell, I'm going to be making money. And I had the store a week, and I was driving down the road, and some old lady was in front of me, and she pulled out, stopped in the middle of the highway. I tapped the back of her car with my truck. Cardinal has a policy, any rear end collision, you're fired instantly. So I lost that job, and I went into this crappy freight company where I was making $500 a week, working hours, driving junk equipment. And that's where I met these guys who drank more than I drank, you know, if that was possible. And I hooked up with them. And somehow, online, I met this girl in California. And God used her to take me out of that. And I was still drinking, but we were talking online, talking on AOL then. It was AOL or whatever it was. And she just started building me up. And God used her to build me up. And I had a relationship with her for about a year and a half. And she is a paraplegic. She's in a wheelchair. But I loved her because I'd never been loved like that. I'd never been loved without condition. It was always some conditional strings attached, you know. And so, you know, I thought I loved her to the point that I wanted to see what a relationship with her would be like. She was in California. So I stewed over it for almost a year. We'd buy these Walmart, before cell phones had unlimited, you could go to Walmart and buy these calling cards, you know, for 500 minutes. I had a stack of them that deep by the time I moved to California. And all of them were 1,500 minutes or 1,000 minutes. So we'd sit on the phone for hours and hours and hours. And we had this long distance relationship. And I said, okay, finally I said, all right, I'm coming, and we're going to see how it works out. And I went to California, and I immediately, my drinking went way down to almost, you know, having a few beers after work, and that was it. And we started having, you know, seeing how this relationship was going to work, and I was sharing with her the stuff that, and God started resurrecting all that stuff that had been just sitting there, you know, that I thought was gone forever. And all this stuff, you know, Andrew Murray, Norman Grubb, all this stuff is coming out of my mouth, and I can't believe it's still there, you know. And she's getting all excited about this life in Christ, but she was so self-conscious about her disability that she always wanted to just stay isolated with us. She didn't want to be in groups, and I couldn't do that anymore. I did that with my first wife. So after about a year, I realized this wasn't going to work. And I got online, and I tried to, over a year's period, I tried to break off the relationship slowly so she wouldn't get hurt. But I realized this probably would have been better if I would have just done it like a Band-Aid and just, because I just made it worse. Because I would break it off, then I'd go back, break it off, and I'd be back, break it off. And finally, I broke it off. And right after that, I was online, and my kid was visiting. My son Chip was visiting me. He said, Dad, he said, you ever heard of Hot or Not? And I said, Hot or Not? He goes, yeah, it's a site you go on, you look at all these girls, and you give them a rating between 0 and 10. I go, well, that sounds real deep. And so anyway, he was sitting on the computer one day. I was at work, and I came home, and he had it up on Hot or Not, and I was looking, I said, pulled up my chair, and I said, wow, this is kind of cool, really. And he goes, well, I'm on here. Do you want me to put you on? And I said, what do you mean? He said, your profile. I said, I don't have a profile. So I wrote up a profile. I put it on there. And, I waited. And I get this call, this connection. And it was Linda, my wife. She was the first one that saw me on there. I saw her first on there. She was the first one. So we went on there at the same time. I was the first one that connected with her. She was the first one that connected with me. But she was with another guy, and I was still trying to break it off with this girl. That was in September. But by November, it was broke off. I was broke off with her, and this other guy, she was going to marry. He walked out on her, and she was crushed. And so we got on one time, and I was just sharing with her my story and stuff. And she knew I'd gone through a lot of pain, so she started asking me stuff. And we started talking, and, and that was in November. And December, my kids were coming out. My ex-wife kicked my 2 boys out of the house, and they had nowhere to live. And I had a small little apartment. I was living with a guy, and Linda said, well, you can come down here, because I was saying, I'd really like to see if a relationship will work with us, And I had no intentions of going back into a relationship after the hell I had just come out of. And she said, well, I've got a shop, and you guys can stay out there. You and your boys can stay out there, and so that'll work out. My dad said it's fine. And so we moved down to Visalia, California from Santa Rosa. And we just started, and I was on disability. I'd hurt my back. And one of the other times I'd hurt my back. And we just started getting to know each other. And I just finished my MBA degree. I have 4 college degrees. I'm a truck driver, 20-year truck driver. I've got an MBA, I've got a BA, I've got an AA and an AAS. And I've never used one of my degrees ever. Because every time I went to try to use one, God shut the door. A few years ago, I was driving truck. I was going between Dallas and San Antonio. I was doing a run for Ryder truck. I was driving down the road, and I'll share with you why in a minute. And I just started screaming at God. I said, God, I'm back in the truck again. Why did I go to all this school? Why did I get a master's degree? What are you going to do with my master's degree? And I had an R-rated conversation with God. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't pristine. Okay, I just had it out with him. It was real. And I didn't hear anything. And I had a long drive. I had a 5-hour drive. And right outside of San Antonio, God said to me, Rich, I had somebody else. He had the equivalent of a doctorate degree. And he said, I count all things as loss. What are you going to do with that? And I said, I'm sorry, God. And I broke down right there. Pulled the truck over to the side of the road. I'm just convulsively weeping. I said, I'm sorry, God. I said, this is your degree. You do with it what you want. I never talked about it again. Never did anything with it again. Turned out God used my AA, my AAS, my BA, and my MBA to teach me how to write. Because I always wanted to write, but I never thought I could. I never thought I was good enough. I never thought there was going to be opportunity. And God was working behind the scenes the whole time for 11 years as I was going to school for a business degree. God was teaching me how to write through all these classes because English was my strong suit anyway. So in California with Linda in 2004, I'd finished my master's degree. And then I started looking at pharmaceutical sales because pharmaceutical sales in 2004 was booming, okay? And over the course of the next 2.5 years, I applied for somewhere between 300 and 400 jobs. I would commit 40 hours to a company that I was going to interview with and put together a resume, cover letter, thank you letter. I mean, I learned how to do resumes. I learned how to interview. I was an expert at it. I could teach it today, okay? And I had somewhere around 80 interviews. I came 1 or 2 in every interview, and the one thing I always lacked was sales experience. I had everything else they wanted, but I didn't have enough sales experience. I was a salesman in the late 80s, early 90s, and they always said that was too old. It wasn't current enough. And I had an offer from Medline, medical sales. The guy in the interview was a brother in Christ. My interview basically was talking about Galatians 2:20. He said, "You're the guy. I'm part of the hiring team. I want you." He said, "Go and pick out your car," because they give you a car, you know. So Linda and I went out and we looked for cars and said, "This is it," you know. Didn't hear anything. Week later, 2 weeks later, nothing. If they don't call you back after an interview, don't bother calling them because they've picked somebody else. I learned that the hard way. So I called him and he said, you know, right at the final end of the thing, somebody came in from inside the company and they wanted that territory, and so we had to give it to them. So I lost that. He said in the interview, he said, within 2 years, you'll be making $300,000 a year with an MBA. That was gone. Merck Pharmaceuticals interviewed me 6 times in one day. What they did is they had a hiring fair, 2 days, actually a day and a half. They'd rent out the rooms in a hotel, and they'd have district managers in different rooms. And you went in, and you all sat in one room, and it was a big waiting area. You'd interview with one manager, and if you made it, you'd come back to go to the next one. And it was a process of elimination based on, and each time you'd go further up the scale in the management until you came to the regional manager. And at the end of the first day, I was the only one left in the waiting room. And the 2 girls at the receptionist there handing you the bottles of water and, you know, and taking your lunch order and whatever. Said, "Oh, you've got the job, Rich, for sure. There's no way you don't have the job. Look, there's nobody else here. You're the only one here. It's you and a bunch of chairs." So I go home and I said, "Linda," I said, "I got the job with Merck." Next day, didn't hear nothing. Week later, didn't hear nothing. 2 weeks, finally got a hold of the guy. He said the next day we had the hiring fair for about 3 hours. He said the last person that came in had pharmaceutical sales experience. We had to hire him. I was in the fetal position on my bed, and my wife and kids had to come in and console me. I was destroyed. Same thing with Sanofi of Venice. They took me out. I went on the run with one of the pharmaceutical sales. Came back, didn't hear nothing. With a freight company, transportation sales, they were ready to hire me. One of their inside sales reps decided he wanted the job. And then there's a company called, not Publicis, it's a big lumber company, big lumber distributor. Anyway, I got that job. And remember I told you about Ken and Sue Stewart from the union group? I was visiting Ken. And I was saying, "Ken, if something doesn't open up in California pretty soon," I said, "I've applied for almost 400 jobs there in 2.5 years. I said, "I've got 80 interviews. I'm not getting anything there. If something doesn't come, happen soon, I'm going to have to, move out of there." He said, "Well, why don't you come here? You can live with us." And we hit it off at the Louisville thing. I said, "Well, if this one doesn't work out," and I think it does because the guy told me I had the job before I left the interview, and I thought, yeah, okay, well, I'd had that happen before, Right then the phone rang, my cell phone. "Sorry, Rich. I wanted you, but the other guy in the hiring team, he said you didn't have enough sales experience." That was the deciding factor to move to Texas. So we moved to Texas. And when I got to Texas, I went to work for a company I thought I wanted to be an operations supervisor. I went to work for this company, and I hated it. And in that month, Linda's grandmother died and left her entire family this huge inheritance, and she ended up with about $100,000. So Linda, in fact, what happened is my sister got I thought she had spinal meningitis. She was a 3-time cancer survivor at that time. And I thought she contracted spinal meningitis in Florida. And I went in to talk to the supervisor, and I said, I think my sister's dying in a Florida hospital, and I got to go see her. He said, yeah, people have problems every day, Rich. And he said, we can't let you go. I was in my probationary period. I went out on the floor. Linda calls me. She said, I just got the inheritance, because we were waiting for it to happen. She thought it was going to be around $25,000 to $40,000. They offered me $49,000 for that operations supervisor job. I said, well, what'd you get? She said, I got $98,000, double. She said, go in there and tell them that you quit. I walked back into the office and I said, you know what? I can't work for a company that doesn't even respect my family. And I walked out the door. And so I didn't have to worry at that time because she had that inheritance, and so things were going okay. And I was there in 2007. She finally came from California. I came out and I got her house set up and I did all that stuff. She didn't have to do it. And then she got all the moving and packing and everything done. And she finally got to Texas in 2007 in June. And the day before she came, we had a Buick Park Avenue parked in our driveway, and I was going to move it so the moving truck could back up and we wouldn't have to carry this stuff as far. But I had to charge the battery, so I took the battery out of the car, charged it, put the battery back in. And I was putting the battery back in, I dropped a wrench on the driveway, bent down, and tore something in my back. I barely could make it into the house. I mean, I'm taking these little baby steps. I'm in so much pain, I can't even hardly move, and I'm by myself. I walk in the door, I call her, and I said, the moving truck's coming tomorrow. And I said, I can't, there's nothing I can do to help you. Not one thing. That was our introduction to Texas. So we got some friends of Ken and Sue's, and they helped us move, and then we got all that taken care of. And then what happened is her brother contacted her and said, listen, you guys, we know that you're not working right now. And a friend of my brother-in-law's has a bookkeeping business, and he's looking for people to do home bookkeeping. And all I saw was, wow, that looked good on my resume. I got this MBA, that looked good on my resume, a manager of a bookkeeping business. They don't have to know it's a 2-person job doing clerical work in a desk in a house. But so I said, Linda, can we do that? And she said, no, I don't want to do that. But she gave in because she's so awesome. But he said, you got to start right away. So that's why she got out there. And then she had to move and all that, and then this bookkeeping thing. So we started working on that. And, this guy says, well, you should be making $2,500 a month the first month. We didn't make $3,000 in 3 years. So what happened is we started working for him, and then whenever we tried to bow out of it and get out of it, he'd say, well, I don't have anybody. Can you guys wait? And then he'd come up with something else, and he'd say, listen, I got something else I'm working on. This is a money maker. And we just stringing us along. We didn't get that much business, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But, we finally just got tired of it. Linda's dad died, and while we're sitting in the funeral, they call and they want a transaction done. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for her. She said, that's it, I'm done. This thing is gone. I don't care if they have anybody or not. Mm-hmm. And after her dad died, we went back to the house, and we're sitting around and got a call. And it was one of the other bookkeepers, and she said, are you going to be on the conference call tonight? I said, well, we didn't know there was a conference call. And she said, yeah, there's a conference call, and here's the number. So we got on the conference call, and we hear this attorney, and he's saying, yeah, and some have gone to prison, and there's big fines, and there's this and that. But he said, you probably won't go to prison. And we're thinking, are we on the right call? What is this? Find out the guy that we have our bookkeeping business, the brother in Christ, is a con artist, and he's using these bookkeeping business with all these people that are these honest Christians to launder money through. He has a money laundering operation, and the IRS is hot on his tail. But when we signed up, we've got our signatures all over the paperwork. We're the signatories for the accounts, for everything. He hasn't got his name anywhere. He's got this attorney, and he's turning us over to him.
What?
And we weren't supposed to know about that conference. But God had another plan. And so we're supposed to go in and talk to this attorney and defend ourselves on something we've never even done and we don't even know about. We're doing accounts receivable. We're doing paying bills for clients. That's all we're doing. We're taking money, we're putting deposit only, and we're putting it in bank accounts. Okay? And we had this bookkeeping business. Actually, we had 3 by that time, and none of them made any money. And so he says, bring everything in with you, and we're going to set up a meeting. And I'm going to tell you what this is all about. And that was like in July. We finally got in October. And he says, and we sat down in his office. Linda and I sat down in the office. The attorney is sitting on the other side. We've got the box of stuff that he asked us to bring in for the bookkeeping business. And he says, I'm not going to F with you guys. You're looking at 2 years minimum, prison, federal time, and you're looking at $475,000 in fines. And we have no clue. It hits us like a ton of bricks. We have no clue what's going on. And we sit there and we find out that he is represented by the guy who owns the bookkeeping business. And the IRS is coming after him, and he's putting it all on us. And we're sitting there, and he says, but you won't go to prison if you've got a $50,000 retainer. We had nothing. We'd gone through her inheritance. That was gone. Everything, because we had bought a house. That's what we did. We bought a house for cash. So her inheritance was gone. It was in our house. That's what happened. And so I looked at Linda, and she's crying and freaking out and hysterical. And I looked at her, and I said, we'll sell the house. He says, no, you don't have to sell your house. We're doing a group thing with all the bookkeeping things because they're all in the same thing. But he said, you guys are in the worst trouble because he's pinning it all on you. And he said, I'll do it for $20,000. I looked at Linda and I said, we'll sell the house. We didn't have anything. And so we brought all this stuff out and we're showing him all the bank accounts and stuff. And he goes, is this all of it? And Mitch, before we went in, he emailed Linda. That was a guy that owned the bookkeeping businesses. He said, bring all the bookkeeping stuff in, but leave the other behind. And it was an IRA reinvestment company that he had that we were doing too. We were reinvesting IRAs. And for doing the bookkeeping in it, we got a percentage. We got a commission. He said, leave that. He doesn't want to see that. Just bring the bookkeeping stuff in. Well, Linda, honest, integrity, see-through, open and laid bare, she takes it all and brings it in. And Rick, when he's done talking to us, and we're his enemy at this point in time. He's representing Mitch. Mitch is turning us in. This attorney is coming after us. He's a former intelligence officer. He's a former brigadier general, high up in the CIA, in the Internal Revenue. And he's starting his own business. And what he does, he helps people get out of tax evasion and that type of thing because he knows the ropes, okay? One of the top attorneys in the United States. And he's a Muslim, okay? And he's coming after us and he's attacking us. And he goes, what else do you got in that box? And Linda goes, oh, just the IRA stuff. He goes, what do you mean the IRA stuff? He goes, and when we started explaining to him what he goes, oh, that blank scam. And he said, he goes, didn't Mitch tell you about that? That's what Linda said. He goes, no, I didn't know anything about it. And the reason he didn't know anything about it because $240,000 was sitting in an account that Mitch didn't want him to know about. If everything came down, he had something to fall back on. So right there, Rick went from being our enemy to being our best friend. And so he says, well, what do you got in that box? And Linda says, we've got the debit cards for the accounts, and we've got the checking account. He goes, do you know all that money is yours? Do you know that $240,000 is yours and Linda's? And I said, why? He goes, because your name's on the account. Nobody else has access to it. Mitch hasn't got anything to do with it. He says, that's your money. He goes, it's not, but he goes, you guys could have touched that all along and nobody would have done anything about it. Now with the IRS breathing down his throat, he's not going to go near those accounts. And so he says, take out the checkbook. And he says, he said, Linda, sign your name to 2 checks. So she signed her name to one. He says, that's my retainer, paid for in full out of that account. And he says, sign another one. He says, that's your wages for work in the last 3 years. The worker is worth his wages. He's a Muslim. He says the worker deserves his wages. And he wrote out a check to us for 10 grand. We walked in there, sat down, thought we were going to prison for 2 years. Not only us, but our stepdaughter was also involved in this. She was 23 at the time. She was going to prison too. We walked out of there with a $10,000 check in our hand and a $20,000 retainer paid for. That was the grace of God. And so what happened is he started representing us, and we didn't have any idea what was going on. Then right after that, in 2008, I hurt my back. That's when I hurt my back, and I was on disability from that time. And I thought during the time that I'm on disability, remember I shared with you that I have this problem when I fly. My head feels like it's going to explode. So I was going to get sinus surgery because I heard somebody say you can get surgery to relieve that. And so I'm getting ready to have this sinus surgery. I've got medical benefits at this time, one of the few times that I do. You can come on. And so I go in and I get my MRI for the sinuses, and the doctor walks in and his head's down, and we're getting ready. I'm on the table getting ready to go to surgery, and he says, I got something I have to show you. And I knew that wasn't good. And he said, he took my x-rays, he put them down, he said, see that right there? Spot like that on my brain. He goes, you got a brain tumor. That was during the time of the bookkeeping thing. That was on top of that. So we're dealing with all that. Plus now, he's telling me I've got a brain tumor. My kids are sitting out in the waiting room. I'm going in for routine sinus surgery, and I come out having to tell him I have a brain tumor. But you know, God showed up right there, right in that minute. And I came out of the waiting room, and I couldn't even believe what came out of my mouth. I said, you know what? They just found something on my brain. And I said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go celebrate. Because God is bigger than that. And he's doing something. I've watched him over the course of my life. And every time he's brought me into the pit, he's brought me out on the other side. And he's doing something in this that's bigger than us. And my kids were all crying. And Linda was crying. And so we went to the cotton patch, and I said, you order whatever you want. This is a celebration. And I had a wonderful meal, and we got done. And we had to wait 6 weeks before I found out that it wasn't a brain tumor, it was an arachnoid cyst. It was on top of my brain. It's kind of like an extra water jacket, but on an MRI it shows up as a spot, like a tumor. Well, what God did, the big thing God did, is at that time, my older daughter and my older son and my youngest daughter, I got 5 kids, were all starting to see the reality of what God was doing in my life, because I had been geographically separated from them for years. They didn't understand why Dad couldn't be around, you know. And they were starting to see it and understand what God was doing. And they loved Linda. And they understood that Linda was better for me than their mom, okay, at that point. My other 2 kids were still believing the lies from their mom. So God used that to bring my other 2 kids back into the fold, because they thought I was going to die. So over the next 6 weeks to 3 months, God brought them back. And then in 2008, that was in 2008. And I'd gone to, and I was still trying to do something with my MBA. And I started, I went to Linda went to a dinner, and it was some sales thing where they were selling fire safety equipment. And she said, you know what, I think Rich could do that. And so I went from driving a truck to selling fire safety equipment. And it was during that time that in 2011, I bent down at a Goodwill, local Goodwill, and I was reaching for a book for my new grandson, and I felt something pop in my back. And I thought, well, I drove a truck for 20 years. I'll just go home and ice it, and I'll be okay tomorrow. And I was hard walking out of there, but I did, and I went home and I iced it and I laid down. Next morning I couldn't get out of bed. I thought, this isn't good. And Linda had gone to chiropractors her whole life. She loved them. I thought they were all quacks. So she said, this looks like something that your chiropractor would tell you. Don't lay around, because I was laying around. I couldn't move. I was in pain, the worst pain I'd ever experienced. And she said, well, if you lay around too much, it's going to stiffen up and it's going to get worse. So you need to work it out. You need to walk around. Well, I couldn't take a step without going through the roof. But I started walking around and I started doing what she said. We went to a chiropractor and he put me on a table and he did one of these things on my back, and I just about went into orbit. And he said, this is not something chiropractic. He goes, you need to get an MRI. We didn't have no money. And so Linda, we dealt with that for 30 days. 30 days I laid on my back in my bed in pain, the worst pain I'd ever experienced in my life. After the 16th day, the 27th of April, 2011, Linda walked in the room. And I was just sitting there praising God and worshiping Him in my pain. And no, I wasn't. I was sitting there whining and pissing and crying and asking God, why me? This is after 30 years of being a so-called deep Christian. But I was real with God. He was real with me. That was our deal we had all through my life. You be real with me and I'll be real with you. And Linda walked in the door and she said, Dave Wilkerson just died in a head-on collision outside of Dallas. I said, what? She said, yeah, he got hit by a semi and his wife's alive. And all of a sudden, just the presence of God just filled that room and I just broke down and I just started crying. Wilkerson had been so paramount in my life from 1982 to 1999. I followed him. I saw him as the only voice of truth out there in the media world. I read the deep teachers, but I thought Wilkerson was right along that same line, And God just brought back all of the things that Dave Wilkerson. In my garage, I have every newsletter from 1982 to 1999. I used to run to my mailbox for those newsletters, for the truth. And he just brought all that back, and I just sat there and convulsively weeping. And God just said, and this isn't just about Wilkerson. This is about you too. He said he just gave his life. He didn't know it, but he just gave his life. So what are you going to do with yours? And I said, God, I see you can have it. And I'd like to say at that point in time, I was healed and I got up and started walking around, but it got worse. That was about the 16th day of my ordeal. And on the 30th day, Cindy Estep on Facebook, Linda went on there and said, Rich needs an MRI. And Cindy rallied the troops, June Melanson, Susie Goldman Cox, Cheryl Lowry. And within 12 hours, they raised $600 for me to have an MRI. Went in and got the MRI. And usually it takes, a day or two to get MRI results back, typically. I get home, an hour later the phone rings. It's the doctor. He says, you need to get to the emergency room now. Don't waste another minute. Get there now. He goes, you have an abscessed infection in your spinal cord. And he says, if it pops, he goes, because I explained to him, I went to the chiropractor and he did that. He goes, you are lucky that chiropractor didn't kill you, he said. So if that would have popped, you'd be dead or at least paralyzed. He said, you need to get down there and what they're going to do. And he goes, don't go to the Weatherford Hospital. They don't know what they're doing. I just had an 18-year-old kid come in a week ago with the same exact thing. He's in JPS Hospital in Fort Worth right now on antibiotic treatment. And he's going to be okay. And you need to do the same. You're going to go in, you're going to get a 30-day antibiotic drip. So I go in there, packed Thursday night, packed walls to wall, the emergency room. Linda and this other friend of ours are gingerly walking me in, kind of half carrying me into the place. I hand the lady my pictures. Within an hour, I'm in the back room on a gurney getting high doses of morphine because they know what this is all about. And I went in on the 17th of May. I went in, and I came out on the 28th of June. And they were giving me these antibiotics, and it was supposed to make everything go down and all the swelling and everything. And one day I got out of bed and I put my foot on the floor, and that pain that I felt when I hurt my back was nothing compared to that. I literally just screamed, "Oh, man." And the nurse saw me and she said, "I've got to get the doctor." And he came in and he said, "We're going to do an MRI on that, see what that's doing." He said, "It should be going down by now. You've been on this stuff. You know, this is heavy antibiotics you're on." And they did an MRI, and he said, "You've got a spot on your kidney. So we want to check that out." So tonight, 2 o'clock in the morning, they're going to come for you, and they're going to bring you down and do a PET scan or CAT scan or whatever it is. We're going to find out what it is. So they did. Next day he walks in. He says, "Rich," he says, "you've got a grapefruit-sized tumor on your kidney." And he says, "What's happening is that tumor is causing your kidney to press up against your spine. And when you put your foot down on the floor the other day, you were just in the position where it caused that pain to happen the way it did." And he said, "And it's probably cancer." He goes, "A tumor that big is most likely cancer." He goes, "It's swallowing up the kidney." He goes, "We can't even do a biopsy on it because," he goes, "the only way we can do a biopsy on it is if we remove the kidney. So we have to remove the kidney." So we found that out, and on June 7th, the day before my wife's birthday and 3 days before our 6th anniversary, they did surgery on me to remove my kidney. Now, most of the times when they remove a kidney, they come over here and cut you. I'm cut from here all the way down to here because the tumor was so big they had to pull everything out of me so they could get to it. And they had to pull it out from the front. They did a biopsy on the tumor. Every doctor in the place, every part of the surgical staff, every one of them knew it was cancer. It came back, no cancer. 70% chance, he said, that tumor at walnut size has a 70% chance of being cancerous. Yours is the size of a grapefruit and there's no cancer. None. And so I recovered and I got out of the hospital at the end of June and tried to go to work because we had to have an income. And this lady had been reading my stuff for a long time, since 2010, and once in a while she'd comment or like something on Facebook. I started writing on Facebook in 2010. A friend of mine said, "Rich, the stuff that you talk about, other people need to know." So I wrote my first article, February 25th, 2010. It was titled, "Only God, Only Now." And it was this long. And I got like 50 comments from it. And I didn't even know what Facebook was 3 days before that, except something my wife went on and talked to her kids, you know. So I got on there and I started writing. And by the end of 2010, I'd written 100 articles. By the end of 2011, I'd written 300 articles. And that's what this book is right here. It's a compilation of those articles that I wrote. So anyway, we met. This lady wrote, she said, "You know, the stuff that you write, Rich, it's changed my life. I've known union my whole life, but I never knew about God's power perfected in my weakness the way that you've shared it. And I've watched you and I've watched Linda in your journey with this whole thing with your medical." And she goes, "Would you mind if I contributed $200 to your ministry a month?" And I said, here's what my response was. I didn't know I had a ministry. I mean, that's how focused I was on not being in the ministry at that point in time. At one time, I would have killed to be a part of the ministry. I applied for 3 colleges, including Jimmy Swaggart's Bible College. I'd gotten approved by Jimmy Swaggart, and then he had his tryst with a prostitute during the approval process, and everything went down again. So I would have died to be in the ministry. And so anyway, I said, "Yeah, sure." I said, "You can do that." A couple months later, she saw what Linda and I were going through. She goes, "Do you mind if I give a little more?" And then she shared with me her testimony. She said, years ago God said I would be his Abigail. And I would give in the same way that Abigail gave to David, to God's man. And her husband didn't approve of it. And neither did Abigail's husband approve of it. So she said, I want to give to this ministry. And I only want to give to this ministry. She quit all of her giving. They were wealthy. Okay, they had been wealthy in their life. She quit all of her giving and she's given only to us. And over the last 2 years, she's given about $60,000 to our ministry. She supports us solely. If it's not for Joni, and her walking by the faith of the Son of God in her story, believing us, and us walking in the faith of the Son of God, and God bringing her along, that's how this ministry is today. And the whole purpose of that story is that God's power is perfected in our weakness. And what has to happen is he has to roll death in on everything that we're holding on to. And what he did over 32 years in my life is everything that I trusted in, God brought back to me that prayer that I prayed in 1983. Rich, do you really want everything I have for you? Do you really want everything I have for you? Then this has to go, and this has to go. And no, you can't be a pharmaceutical rep. And no, you can't have this. And no, this isn't going to happen. And that's really my testimony. My testimony is that God's power is perfected in our weakness. And that through all of the pain and all of the suffering that we go through as believers, he has one goal, and that's to take us from being future and past minded into being now minded, now centered, today. See, condemnation is there for a reason. It's like a big flashing red light that says, if you come this way, you're walking in some place you're not supposed to be. Fear is in the future. That's the same thing. And those two things are the boundaries that keep us walking in now. But we don't see them that way because we've been taught in a whole different way. We're supposed to, grieve over our weaknesses. We're supposed to grovel over our weaknesses. And Paul says we're supposed to boast in our weaknesses. If you don't have the positive and the negative, the battery doesn't work and there's no power. We're the absolute negative. He's the absolute positive. That relationship will never change. And when that relationship is functioning the way it's supposed to be, power is always released. Always released. And so God has chosen to take me to nothing. He chose for me to have the same kind of life as the Apostle Paul. When Paul says he was shipwrecked and he was beaten and he was this and that and that, that was over time that happened. And then he was in danger from everybody. And what he came to the conclusion was that everything was Christ. God eliminated everything. My life started out like a funnel. And everything and all my hopes and dreams. And that funnel got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And now all there is one. Christ in everything. The good, the bad, the in-between. And so I'm out here proclaiming to people who struggle with their everyday life that their struggle is as much God as their times of blessing. Because without the struggle, there can't be the growing. There can't be the mature body. There's the infant body. There's the elementary teachings that Paul said we're to move beyond. And the only way that can happen is through the losing to gain cross. It's losing to gain. We have to lose our life in order to gain His. And we can lose it one of two ways. We can willingly give it up or God will take it from us. Because He says in Matthew that we can't serve two masters. We can't serve God and we can't serve fill in the blank. And at one time, my kids were the center of my life. God touched that. One time, my career was the center of my life. God touched that. One time, ministry was the center of my life. God touched that. And now all that remains is Christ at the center of my life. That's it. There's nothing else. There's nowhere else to go. And that's really what my story is. My story is coming through pain and sorrow and brokenness and impossible situations that are so far beyond man and what man can do. and God revealing himself to me, who I thought was the cruel taskmaster, who I thought was the punishing God, who I talked to as the punishing God most of my Christian life because that's what I was told he was, until he brought me to nothing. And then he showed me the foundation that was already laid, which was his unconditional, no strings attached love for me, and the fact that he'd never leave me or forsake me. And with those two things, I now know that anything that I face that I can deal with, I can go through it. I can go through anything now. I've been ruined financially. I've been ruined physically. I've been ruined relationally. I've been ruined identity-wise. I've lost my reputation. I've lost the treasures of this world, and I've really not lost one thing. That's the mystery. That's the mystery that Paul was talking about. The mystery in the losing to gain message of the cross is that we gain him, and in him consists everything else. So we either get to have God or we get to have God and everything in him. And there's a big difference. Because one causes you to continue to walk with a separated and divided and distant and impersonal view of God, and the other lets you see him as you see yourself as the expression of who he is in your form. And so you can glory in whatever state you're in. You can do what Paul said. Paul said, I came to the place, he said, where he learned the secret to contentment. And I asked God, I said, what was that secret, Lord? He said, it was me now. It was knowing me now. Paul learned how to love God now. He learned now was his entire eternity. He learned that in the now moment, he had everything pertaining to life and godliness. And so he was content. Whether he was abased or he was abounding, he was content. And because of that, he said, I could do all things through Christ. In reality, it was Christ doing all things through Paul. Because Paul knew he could do nothing apart from Christ. So that's what my ministry is. And now what's happened is I've gone from writing, I'm going to plug my book, 31-day devotional. It's written in the style of Andrew Murray, day 1 to day 31. And each day is something in here of what I've gone through, open and laid bare. I'm transparent in every possible way, but it's also what God has revealed for everybody. And I believe this book can change anybody's life who wants the same thing that God challenged me with in 1983, and that is him alone as your all in all. This book can help you get there.
Is it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon.com. Just look up Rich in Christ or Rich Novek. I'm also on Facebook, Rich in Christ. I've also got richinchrist.com, richinchristnow.com. And I'm also a life coach. Just started that out. That's in its infancy, richinchrist.lifecoaching.com. And if anybody wants to go there and they want to contact me, my whole passion is helping anybody who wants to go there. That's why this book is kind of a play on words. This isn't about me. This is about everybody. Everybody is rich in Christ. They just don't know it. And so Stacy has been gracious enough to let me be here. This is my first speaking tour ever. I've been desiring this for 30 years. I was speaking at Lakeland where all of the hell broke loose. And that was the first place God had me speak, which makes perfect sense because he's restored everything in my life. And so I'm here with Stacy, and I'm going to share with their group tonight. And so
Glad to have you.
thank you.
Yeah.
So that's my story. I'm sticking with it. Thank you.